So the first post is rational versus scientific Ev-Psych. He just says Ev-Psych. I believe now everyone has kind of defaulted to calling it Evo-Psych because it's easier to say.
It definitely is.
Yes. But anyways, he relates about this time that he was looking in the fridge, waiting for the ketchup to jump in front of him, and then came up with this idea that men are hunters. So if we, in the ancestral environment, men are hunters. So if we can't find our prey, we instinctively freeze motionless and wait for it to wander into our field of vision. Women are gatherers, so they move things around and look behind them. This seemed like very much the kind of lol evo psych sort of thing that people lol at nowadays.
Yeah.
Do you concur?
I mean, yeah, but to be fair, or to be clear, rather, so he says, this is the sort of just so story that people make up and get criticized for. And he says,
yes,
well, fine.
He wasn't.
But he says, well, fine, but I bet it's still true. I have no idea why he's confident in that.
Yeah.
Like, I think that is one of the weakest explanations I can imagine. Like, I think his mom probably has more experience looking for shit she can't find because she's older, right?
Yeah.
So she moves stuff in the fridge, or she put it there.
Right.
Like maybe there's more evidence than he has from this one story, but if I was trying to explain this one incident of me staring vacantly at the fridge and somebody comes up and be like, oh, it's behind this, I would assume that they put it there before I assumed going back 80,000 years of, generations of hominids hunting on the savannah, right?
Yeah.
So I'm kind of amazed that he took this, and he even said, well, fine, but I bet it's still true. But he should have said, well, fine, but I bet I can make a case for it.
Right. I mean, the rest of the post is very interesting, but the fact that he goes with, I bet it's still true, made me scratch my head.
I'm glad it wasn't just me.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe he has updated on that position, or maybe he has found compelling new evidence that backs him up.
I hope he's right. Like that.
Really?
Yeah. Just because, like, for as far as I'm concerned, he shouldn't be. Like, that makes no sense.
Right.
And so it would be funny if he was.
That would be awesome.
Yeah. All right.
So he pulled out this thing, which I thought was a cool point. It's kind of long, but I'll try to read it fast. There's some people who will, if you just tell them the refrigerator hypothesis, and snort and say that's an untestable just so story and dismiss it out of hand. But if you start telling them about the idea of the gaze tracking experiment and explain the evolutionary motivation, he had a whole experimental setup that you could do to test if this is actually a thing or not, or at least in theory, this was like an idea that you could test with this gaze tracking thing. He said they will say, that might be right, because then, you see, you are proposing a scientific hypothesis. In the earlier case, you were just making up a story without testing it, which is very unscientific. We all know that scientific hypotheses are more likely to be true than unscientific ones. If you have a hypothesis you have not figured out how to test with an organized, rigorous experiment, then your hypothesis is not scientific. When you figure out how to do an experiment, and more importantly, set out to do the experiment, then your hypothesis becomes scientific indeed. You are judging probabilities using the affect heuristic, and you know that science is a good thing, then making the jump from merely rational to scientific might seem to raise the probability. And this is where I thought he had a good point, because really nothing has changed. Like, first someone came up with a crazy I'm looking for the ketchup to jump in front of me idea, and people say that's dumb. And then he comes up with like, well, but hold on, here's a way you could possibly test that. And then if someone were to say, okay, that seems more scientific, so it seems to be more likely. Like, all that was done was someone proposed a way to test it. That shouldn't change the likelihood of how likely it is to be true, right?
I'm glad that you hit that point, because as I was thinking about it again, because my first read, I'm like, well, of course, being able to test it raises the reasonableness of believing in it, right? But I think I maybe it was affect heuristicing, or maybe I was just not properly grokking what he was saying here. So what he's saying is like, all right, I've got proposition A. Does it sound reasonable? And then I've got proposition A. Here's how I would test it, and people would judge the second situation as more likely than the first, even though you've got the same proposition.
Yeah.
So the proposition is the same level of reasonableness based on whether or not you can test it. I suppose that makes sense. What you could say, though, is that, it is like, what I think what I would say to this is like, not that it's scientific. In fact, I find the idea of this study I don't think it would bear any fruit. But what I could say is like, okay, that is a reasonable thing to investigate. That's interesting, right?
Mm-hmm. I could see maybe it, being more interesting once you start thinking of ways to test it, because that's just kind of like an inherently interesting mental task exercise. But I do think that this may be a thing that made people lend more credence to stuff just because it is now suddenly associated with scientism, whatever. That it makes it seem more reasonable for no good reason, and maybe that's like why both Ev-Psych caught on with some people, and also why it got a bad name, because just making up a story about like, oh, this might be why this is true, shouldn't really change how likely something is to be true or not. And therefore people who are swayed by like, oh, this might be true because this maybe happened in the ancestral environment, would become very annoying to people very soon, very quickly, right?
Yeah, I have to imagine that Ev-Psych caught on because on the one hand, it's like it's intriguing. You know, oh look, we can explain some of our behaviors by extrapolating what we think our ancestors might have been motivated to do. You know, there's something kind of capturing about that, right? And then, you know, I could see it getting derided because, you know, you can't test any of this stuff. You can't go grab 100 of our ancient ancestors and do science at them. So I could see how like very hard, whatever Popperian scientists maybe might, you know, draw contention with that.
Well, also, like, it just, someone could say something like, well, women are shorter because when they gave birth, the baby didn't have as far to fall if they were shorter, so it was more likely to survive the birth. And then if someone said, oh yeah, I guess so, that's a good point. Like, soon people would really start to roll their eyes at any Ev-Psych explanation, because making up a story shouldn't convince you of something that you can just measure in the real world whether it's true or not, that this is a thing that happens when women give birth, if babies suffer concussions or not, based on the tallness of a woman.
Also, that's not psychology, right?
Right,
but,
yeah.
But no, but point taken. I mean, my first thought was like, I'd like to show you the giraffe, where its first experience of being alive, or I guess being born, is like the 3-foot drop to the ground. Because the mom does give birth standing up.
Awesome.
Whereas humans don't. Yeah, that's, you know, it's interesting. I think there's a lot to be found. I think it's nice to think through an evolutionary lens, but, you know, like as the, I guess zooming out, thinking about it, maybe this will come up in the next reading too, but I don't know, like other than maybe signaling justifications, you know, status hierarchy stuff, what sort of things that like I think about with evolutionary psychology that actually bears any fruit in my real life. But
I mean, I guess the hunter versus gatherer distinction is probably a big one, but it's always hard to say what effect that would really have, right?
Yeah.
Like, does it make any sense to say that since, you know, men were generally the hunters and women were gatherers, therefore men would have an instinct to freeze and wait for game to walk by? I'm not sure if that holds at all. And if it did, I'm not sure that would relate in any way to looking in a refrigerator.
Yeah, there's so many jumps there, right?
Yeah.
I
mean, it's obvious that we evolved like all species do, and we have some idea of what the ancestral environment was like, but it's too easy, like a lot of people have said, to make up stories that seem right, but then turn out not to have anything to do with anything.
Yeah, like I notice right now that I'm furrowing my brow when I'm thinking about this. You know, one reason that we have eyebrows is to keep shit from falling in our eyes, right?
That's what I've heard.
But and you know, I'm sure eyebrows are largely for expressive purposes. Eyelashes help keep stuff out of your eyes too. But you know, I guess I'm thinking like, oh, I can invent stories as to why I'm making this facial expression. But honestly, they're all just stories.
Right.
And I don't know if I made up two, which one I would call more reasonable. Well, unless I made one really stupid, right?
Yeah.
So
I think mainly we should let Ev-Psych be done by the actual evolutionary psychologists out there, who probably hang their heads in shame and groan loudly whenever lay people try to do stuff and say things like, that's not how Ev-Psych works, stop making us look dumb.
Yeah, that sounds like a good plan.
The post also says, figuring out a way to test a belief with an organized, rigorous, repeatable experiment is certainly a good thing, but it should not raise the belief's rational probability in advance of the experiment succeeding. Which is,
Yeah.
Many agrees. Thumbs up.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation that I'm glad you, like I said, glad you hit that twice, because that is a really cool kind of inversion of thinking. Because to me, my first thought is like, well, of course it does, and then like, wait a minute, no, it doesn't. Which is interesting, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. At least it was for me the moment I had that realization. So
I think one of the really cool things at the very end here is he kind of does a judo flip at the end where he says that conversely also, if someone makes a evolutionary just so story and you cannot figure out how to test it in any organized, rigorous, repeatable way, nonetheless, it may have a substantial rational credibility, equaling the degree that you would expect a experiment to succeed if you could just figure out some way to do such an experiment. Which was, it's like, it's neat the way he says, like, just like if you can think of an experiment, it shouldn't raise your probability estimate. Also, if you can't think of a way to experimentally test it, that shouldn't decrease your probability estimate. It's just as reasonable beforehand, even despite the fact that we don't have the tools to test it. I'm like, that's a weird, interesting point. Okay.
and it follows. It's interesting. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think for me, I think in my head I was conflating like reasonableness in believing and probability of being true. Wait, hold on, those are the same. I was thinking of I don't know. No, I can't articulate it. But yeah, I guess, if someone's like, oh, I've got this really cool idea and I can't give you any idea of how to test it, like, oh, I guess what I was thinking was, the difference between how good of an experiment I can design or how good of a story I can tell as to why this might be the case.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like if I'm trying to think of some convoluted thing involving, ice melting in my car or something, right? Like, I don't know, line up a bunch of random stuff, like nature, right?
It gets infused with phlogiston while it's in your car because your car has a high phlogiston concentration.
Well, I'm thinking like if I don't know, whatever, an icicle melted and fell and broke the windshield or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I couldn't test that. All the evidence is gone because I came home a week later, right?
Yeah.
But it's a much better explanation than like a small meteorite hit it, right? Just because it's way less, it's way more likely, right?
Yeah.
So just because you can't test something doesn't mean that like some explanations aren't better than others.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, I can dig it.
Cool.
All right, what's our failed just so story?
A failed just so story is the next LessWrong post, and it's basically him saying that people said that faith. There's just a so story for why religion and faith exists, and it's that religion helps groups outcompete other groups, and faith helps religions be strong. And he is very much in opposed to the idea that group selection in humans is a strong driver of human evolution. He points to the fact that humans have an equal split of male and female people being born as evidence of that. And so he said that faith, it's a failed just so story for why faith exists. He says, if faith is a true religious adaptation, I don't see why it's even puzzling what the selection pressure could have been. Heretics were routinely burned alive just a few centuries ago. Like, you don't need the selection pressure of group selections. All you need is the selection pressure of people without adequate faith were killed.
Yeah, I think that the idea that people were more likely to fight for their gods than they were for nothing, so they won in conflicts. That's not an explanation with a lot of explanatory power.
Mm-hmm.
Like Dan Dennett postulates the hyperactive agency detection software.
Mm-hmm.
So like the example I remember him giving in one of his books was like you're sitting reading a book and like some snow falls outside the window and your dog perks up and it's like, who's that? Who's there? Right? Mm-hmm. And the dog is like, oh, nobody, I'll stop. But the person can sit there and imagine, oh, something knocked that off. Must be like the snow god, right? And it could be and modeling events as agents you can make an argument for why that might be adaptive, right?
Right.
So at least there he's able to lay out like a chain of reasoning that I'm like, okay, at least that makes some sense. I could follow that for longer than I can follow they won more wars, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Since this was there was nothing else for me to pull out of here, so I also pulled out Robin Hansen's quotes. Quote a reply near the bottom where he said, "There's a lot of good stories about individual fitness advantages from religion that have nothing to do with burning heretics at the stake," which I thought was, a darn good point. And he didn't go into more details, but I believe we are all pretty much familiar with them already.
Give me one example.
Neighbors are more likely to help you and trust you if you are of their religion.
There you go. I like it. Yeah, I mean, if you pay this costly price to signal your affiliation to the group, you're more likely to actually be part of that group, right?
Yeah.
So when you come next door, be like, "Can I borrow some money or some food?" They'll be like, "Well, I see that you stabbed holes through your hands like the rest of us. You must really care, right? Of course, you can borrow some food.
You're a good Christian hand stabber,
right?" All right, I'm into it.
Yeah. All right. For next week, our 2 LessWrong posts are "But There's Still a Chance," right? And "The Fallacy of Gray."